A peer-reviewed article published in 2022 by the National Library of Medicine reveals that 73% of Americans share the belief that conspiracy theories are out of control. Social media has unfortunately given an immense platform to these deceptions, revealing the modern-day education system's ineffectiveness in arming their students with the tools necessary to properly sort out information from disinformation. The problem has become so great that the free press, the fourth pillar of democracy, is likewise struggling beneath the might of the required fact-checking. The authors of the study note that journalists contend that we are living in the golden age of conspiracy theorizing, a post-truth era in which conspiracy theories have never spread this swiftly nor lodged this deeply in the American psyche. Another study published by the Center for Open Science warns us that individuals who happen to dabble with conspiracy theories are more likely to be violent, informing us that the conviction that an event is the result of a secret plan made by powerful people provides moral justification for acts of violence and collective self-defense. For example, if people believe that the government is spraying toxic chemicals into the air or sacrificing people in terrorist attacks, they should be more willing to break societal rules and use extreme means to defend their own group. In a terrifying warning, the authors reveal that some evidence suggests that conspiracy theories are part of the ideology of almost all extremist groups who turned violent. Citizens around the globe are coming to grips with the danger posed by conspiracies. Throughout history, these theorists have remained at the fringes of society. After all, why would someone want to join the public space if they believed that the Illuminati secretly controls it for nefarious purposes? Today, however, politicians are utilizing conspiracy theories to rise to power, legitimizing fake news by placing it front and center before the assembled masses. Professor Cynthia Wang of Northwestern University tells us that conspiratorial rhetoric has become more mainstream in the conversation around American elections. We're seeing candidates inviting fringe conspiratorial communities onto their platforms. It's a sound strategy, as she notes that research has shown that in times of uncertainty, politicians who use conspiratorial language are viewed as outsiders who can reform the system. But what happens when the outsiders waging a war of falsehoods take power? One historical parallel comes out of Nazi Germany, which fanned the flames of anti-Semitic conspiracies during their rise to power. Their systematic dismantling of the Weimar Republic established one of the most dangerous totalitarian regimes that history has ever bore witness to. The Nazis literally burned away any and all facts that didn't fit their perceived worldview. Albert Einstein, a pacifist Zionist Jew living in Berlin, was among those who sounded the warning bell. Despite his status as a bona fide genius, the world wouldn't listen. It would be to their detriment. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about the man who remains synonymous with the term genius, Albert Einstein. Episode number 4, Not Yet Hanged. Europe's cultural barriers that had been hastily erected after the First World War were dismantled, in large part by the combination of Albert Einstein's fame and his steadfast dedication to pacifism. He behaved as the unofficial ambassador for Germany, despite having rejected that nation's citizenship when he was 16 years old. he approached the challenge with optimism that learned men such as he could ensure that there would never be a Second World War. The French resisted the allure of Einstein far more effectively than their Maginot Line would later hold back the Nazis. 30 members of the Society of French Physicists publicly walked out after Albert, the invited guest of honor, rose up to speak to the group. Historian Ronald Clark writes that the French press was in two minds about the problem of how to regard members of the nation they had fought for more than 4 long years. If a German were to discover a remedy for cancer or tuberculosis, asked one paper, would these 30 men have to wait for the application of the remedy until Germany joined the League of Nations? Einstein's return home to Berlin was even frostier. The deeply anti-Semitic stabbed in the back theory had already sunk its teeth into the frontiers of the motherland. Its rapid spread was an unintended consequence of the previous governing regime refusing to let the people hear any negative news regarding the Great War. Thus, the Kaiser's abdication and subsequent surrender of the troops came as a complete surprise to a population that had falsely come to believe that they were mere weeks away from victory. In order to explain their new reality, many proud Germans embraced the conspiratorial belief that there was an international consortium of high-profile Jews secretly controlling the world. Einstein, well known for being an ethnic Jew, had strongly spoken out against the war, going so far as to express hope that Germany, the country of his birth, lost the war. That was unforgivable to the residents of a nation that had just buried 1,350,000 of their people. As you might imagine, the physicists' post-war celebrity tour throughout the victorious West didn't go over well with the citizens of Berlin. On his last day in Paris, he asked to see one of the battlefields. Clark writes that they were soon among the ruins of war, a landscape of flattened villages, smoldering trench systems, and entire forests leveled by artillery barrage. Frequently, they stopped and dismounted. Einstein was visibly shaken, bewildered, and almost uncomprehending that war could really have been like this, even worse than the propagandists claimed. He turned to his friends. All the students of Germany must be brought here. All the students of the world, so that they can see how ugly war really is. People often have a wrong idea because it comes from books. How necessary it is that they should come and see. Germany only acted on that advice after World War II, preserving the Nazis' extensive system of killing centers in order to force their people to confront what had been done by a government whom they had supported. He continued his efforts at rebuilding the world by joining the newly formed International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, a commission operated by the League of Nations. Everything appeared to be going splendidly until June 24, 1922. On that night, Walther Rathenau, a high-profile German Jew, was murdered in cold blood. He was a strong German patriot, having directed the Raw Materials Department in the German Ministry of War during the First World War. After serving as a member of the German delegation at Versailles, he negotiated a treaty to normalize relations with the Soviet Union. His success there resulted in his appointment as the Foreign Minister of Germany in 1922. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum tells us that, as a Jew and a committed, if conservative, advocate of the Weimar Republic, Rathenau's very person was a lightning rod for the hatred of those on the conservative and radical right who despised the Republic and hated Jews. Among the hateful ditties written about him was the following: "Slay that Walter Rathenau. the goddamn Jewish sow. Zach Roberts, writing for The Librarians, a group devoted to preserving the history of Israel, informs us that months before the murder, there were explicit news reports that he was being targeted. According to Count Harry Kessler's biography of the slain leader, just the day before Rathenau's murder, the chief of police had warned him that if he persisted in driving to his office from his residence on the outskirts of Berlin in a slow, open car, no police in the world could guarantee his safety. Yet Rathenau did not heed the chief's warning, and around 10:45 in the morning of June 24th, a Mercedes edged up next to his. Rathenau was shot with a submachine gun, virtually at point-blank range. A grenade was tossed into his car for good measure. As you might expect, Einstein, another high-profile German Jew who was working towards reintegrating Germany to the international order, was freaked out by the news. Clark writes that the murder was part of a pattern, symbolic of a rising tide of antisemitism which would soon be lapping round his own feet. It pushed him into temporary resignation from the League Committee, and it drove him to the edge of leaving Germany for the second time in less than 2 years. His fear wasn't unfounded, as rumors throughout Berlin claimed that Albert Einstein was the next on the list to be assassinated. The Weimar government wasn't prepared for this new challenge to its authority, despite the fact that 1 year earlier, Rudolf Leibniz had been found guilty of offering a financial reward to anyone who managed to take out the inventor of relativity. Leibniz claimed that it was the patriotic duty to shoot these leaders of pacifist sentiment. His punishment only amounted to a fine of $16. In the wake of the high-profile killings, Einstein began to cancel all planned public appearances in Germany, writing to his friend Marie Curie that he had decided to relinquish as quietly as possible both his position at the Academy and as director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. He ended the letter by writing that, "I shall take this as an excuse to move away from turbulent Berlin to somewhere quiet where I'm able to work. Material conditions have made that impossible here." He reversed this decision only after intervention by the director of the information section of the League of Nations, who convinced him that to leave Germany now would be to abandon ship. The world still had faith in the fledgling Weimar Republic. Their hope was sorely misplaced. Einstein's plans to lower his profile were interrupted in autumn of 1922 when he officially won the Nobel Prize for Physics. The recognition came years after the theory's publication due to two caveats embedded within the prize's criteria, neither of which fit with the special theory. First, the prize ought to be given for a discovery, and Einstein's theory was more of an explanation. Secondly, the prize ought to be granted based upon its benefit to mankind. Although relativity was a massive scientific breakthrough, no one could tangibly point to any use of it, positive or negative, in their day-to-day lives. After much arguing on Einstein's behalf, the committee overlooked both of these facts and turned a giant-sized spotlight on a man who was hoping to be forgotten. The prize money, which was substantial, went directly to his first wife as a condition of their earlier divorce. The conferring of the Nobel Prize once again brought to the forefront a question of Einstein's nationality, as prize winners, like Hall of Fame baseball players, go into the history books identified with just one proverbial baseball cap. The problem was that both Germany and Switzerland claimed him. This came as a shock to the physicists, as he had believed that his acceptance of a professorship in Germany had not required him to once again accept German citizenship. The odds are that his friends, who had pulled every stop to convince Einstein to take the job, had merely assumed that he would never find out that no such loophole existed. Despite having been tipped off that he was in line for the prize, Einstein had concocted a plan to escape the danger of Berlin by traveling to Japan for a series of lectures on relativity. He met Emperor Taisho, the father to Hirohito, and spoke French with the Empress over a cup of tea. He was amazed by what he saw, writing in his diary that the inner palace courtyard is among the most exquisite architecture I have ever seen, and that the Japanese are pure souls as nowhere else among people. It was a 6-month trip that also saw him stop in Palestine and China. The Smithsonian magazine tells us that in Japan, thousands packed auditoriums to hear him expound on his theory of relativity for 3 or 4 hours at a stretch, in remarks laboriously translated from German. It had been 3 years since Sir Arthur Eddington confirmed the bending of starlight as it passed from the sun, a key prediction of Einstein's 1915 theory of general relativity, which explained gravity as a distortion of space-time. It followed his revolutionary 1905 paper on special relativity, which laid the groundwork for his equation for mass-energy equivalence. E equals mc squared. The pressures of his fame came to consume him. Writing after a day of banquets and receptions, Albert notes that, "I was dead, and my corpse rode back to my apartments where it was dragged to a children's Christmas and had to play violin for the children." In another journal entry, he complained about being photographed 10,000 times. Dinner that almost lasts forever. The hostess of the inn is deeply thrilled and, on her knees, bows her head to the ground around 100 times. Before returning home, he managed to stop in Palestine in January of 1924. Although he wasn't a practitioner of any faith, Einstein deeply identified as an ethnic Jew. He had long been involved in the Zionist movement, which sought the restoration of the Kingdom of Israel. The Treaty of Versailles brought their dream closer to reality, as ownership of Palestine was transferred into the hands of the British. The nonpartisan Foreign Policy Research Institute writes that, "If no one asks why did the Palestine Mandate come into being as a British trust of sorts, along with the other British and French mandates that attended the conclusion of the World War, one immediately runs into a wider context composed of an improbable mix of the ordinary and the extraordinary. The ordinary is that it's been common practice since time began for the victor in warfare to seize spoils from the vanquished, and those spoils have prominently included real estate. The extraordinary is that by the time of the Great War, the normative environment had changed in the West to the point where old-fashioned imperial means of absorbing such acquisitions had begun to leave a sour taste on the moral taste buds of the ruling elites, especially in Britain and the United States, and to a lesser extent in France and elsewhere on the continent. Written into the mortgage agreement was the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which identified Palestine as a de facto home for the Jewish people. The local Palestinians weren't consulted on the matter, an issue that Einstein foresaw as being the greatest barrier to the overall project of reclaiming the Jewish ancestral homeland. The Declaration set off a wave of Jewish immigration to the land of their forefathers. Einstein had been specifically co-opted by the Zionist movement for his fundraising prowess. Rather than a political entity, the physicist viewed Jerusalem as a cultural center, telling those who would listen that, for me, the value of the Zionist undertaking lies mainly in the educational and unifying effect on the Jews of different countries. I am not striving for a Jewish state, mainly because I'm against the secularization of Jewry. Aligning his belief to his actions, his involvement in the wider movement was primarily focused with the creation of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Upon its opening, he proclaimed that he knew of no public event which has given him such delight. According to the institution's website, the university represented to him a combination of the commitment to his Jewish identity and his belief in the universal values of the pursuit of truth and respect for every human being. Those values weren't on display in Germany, however. For while he was away, an anti-Semitic disinformation campaign claimed that the trip to Japan was fake news, designed to disguise his secret visit to communist Russia. The temperature hadn't cooled while he was away, and death threats continued to roll in against the professor. Einstein's theory that Berlin's antisemitism would recede had turned out to be a false hope. On November 8, 1923, Adolf Hitler was marching at the head of the failed beer hall putsch. While it was initially thought that the failed coup would result in his humiliation, he had, after all, fled screaming from the police engagement only to be found crying in the corner of an attic. His suicidal tendencies had nearly reduced him to a mere footnote in the historical record. Shockingly, his trial and subsequent imprisonment only propelled him deeper into a life of politics. His embrace of big lies such as the stab-in-your-back theory and the presence of elite Jewish secret societies were literally outlined within his book Mein Kampf. It was these conspiracy theories that enshrined his outsider status, propelling him to the chancellorship of the Weimar Republic. On the date of Hitler's putsch, Einstein was hiding once again from an unrelated death threat, this time concealing himself in the Netherlands for 6 weeks. Clark tells us that Einstein was handicapped in all his efforts to implement his good intentions by the very qualities that made him the genius he was. First, and of overwhelming importance, was his unwavering determination to devote as much time as possible to discovering how the physical world was built. He wanted to aid the Jews, and he wanted to help keep the peace of the world. But whenever he was in danger of becoming too deeply involved, there would be the discovery of some new riddle of the universe that demanded his immediate attention. Kurt Bloomfield, who recruited Einstein into the Zionist cause, shrewdly noted that Zionism and Palestine were only small concerns on his mind. Likewise, the darkening clouds descending upon Germany could be ignored if he just focused on the many scientific papers that had stacked up within his study, his own fortress of solitude, which he forbade his wife from stepping within, even if to clean. In 1923, hyperinflation had begun to erode the foundation of the Weimar Republic after the German government missed one of its mandatory reparation payments. But in 1924, Einstein remained insulated from the devastation that came with the price of bread having risen from 250 marks to 200 million marks over the course of 11 months. Books by the physicists were flying off the bookshelves around the world, and wealthy industrialists ensured that the Kaiser Wilhelm Society's funds were constantly refilled. His salary, however, had been reduced in terms of real value from $17,750 to a mere $1,125. He, like all of Germany, despaired for the future, writing that everyone here knows that the financial obligations laid upon the country cannot be fulfilled as their present figure, even with the utmost exertion. All this has bred in us the conviction that there is no hope of working our way by legitimate means out of our present serfdom. This paralyzes economic activities and drives people to evade taxation and to try to remove their capital from the country. The US came to the rescue with the Dawes Plan, which significantly lowered Germany's reparation payments by extending the timeline for their remittance. As one would expect, however, the sitting politicians paid the price for the hardships inflicted upon their citizens. Paul von Hindenburg was elected as president in the wake of the hyperinflation crisis. He would eventually elevate Adolf Hitler to chancellor in an attempt to politically neutralize history's greatest villain. Einstein spent a large portion of 1925, the year of Hindenburg's political ascension, on a lecture tour in South America. Upon his return to Germany, he buried himself within the dual worlds of mathematics and quantum physics. Such was necessary to flesh out his unified field theory, which attempted to identify the statistical laws necessary to explain the subatomic level. His obsession with work and the lack of exercise that was seen as a direct side effect almost killed him in 1928, when inflammation within the walls of his heart was diagnosed. Despite being put on a salt-free diet, he maintained his infamous sense of humor, joking to one visitor that here lies an old corpse. While he remained sidelined in bed beneath constant doctor supervision, the Nazis took 2.6% of the seats in the latest parliamentary election. It was during this electoral cycle that they had figured out a political formula of initiating politically motivated violence, which they then blamed upon left-wing Jewish provocation. The following year, the world's greatest physicists reached the half-century mark. Clark writes that as he began his 50th year, Germany moved on toward the time, little more than a year away, when rising unemployment, the support of industrialists who feared communism, and the creation of a scapegoat in the shape of the Jews would together transform Hitler's National Socialists into the second largest party in the country. He spent much of the next year discussing contemporary politics while corresponding with scientists across Europe. High-level mathematics and quests for finding out the true nature of God were apparently bad for his frail heart. In 1931, he worked with the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, in an attempt to insert Freud's work into the world's education systems in a grand attempt to indoctrinate the youth into becoming pacifists. The genesis of the idea came during a dinner, when a League undersecretary asked whether Albert would agree that it is no mere chance that your theory of relativity and Professor Freud's psychoanalysis, the League of Nations and its World Court, and other phenomenon of our time have developed together, that they are all an expression of the same revolutionary phase through which the contemporary world is passing. The physicist replied, "Let me think it over," and then proceeded to sit throughout the entire meal, neglecting both food and drink, finally exiting his trance when the meal ended by saying, "You are quite right. I endorse your holyism." Their correspondence was designed to answer the question, is there any way of delivering mankind from the menace of war? Einstein's first answer called for the creation of an extremely powerful yet enlightened international authority. He was challenged, however, to explain how such an institution, which would create peace by threatening overwhelming retaliation, fit within his pacifist ideals. It was then that the foremost experts in their respective fields turned to psychoanalysis in an attempt to suppress humanity's aggressive tendencies. Failure to do so meant that the only way to prevent another world war would be the development of such weapons that humanity would collectively dread war. In other words, peace by the threat of terror. Their theoretical ideas were never implemented, however. Germany was at the forefront of the resistance, refusing to even publish the letters after they appeared in book form. Education tends to recycle old ideas, granting them a new name and then presenting them as the next big thing that will revolutionize the field. In the 21st century, Freud and Einstein's ideas have been repackaged as social emotional learning, or SEL. Psychoanalysis believes that deep within the subconscious lies our repressed past, which rears its often ugly head in the form of emotional outbursts. All too often, these outbursts turn violent. The group advancing students forward tells us that SEL is a skill development process through which we learn how to manage emotions, problem solve, and create positive relationships with others. The Wallace Foundation mentions that the process is empirically shown to reduce violence 99 times within its 122-page report on the program. A famous Jew living in Berlin in 1930, however, couldn't wait until the first graduates of this theoretical psychoanalysis curriculum collectively decided to run en masse for positions within the government. The collapse of the American stock market on October 24, 1929, ushered in the Great Depression and resulted in the withdrawal of American support for the German economy via the Dawes Plan. The resulting pullout served as a springboard for Adolf Hitler to urge the German people to accept him, and him alone, as their political savior. Historian J.M. Roberts teaches that the economic crisis destroyed these people's expectations and hopes. The pre-war world now appeared irretrievably lost, and many were convinced that the new course of events was leading inexorably downhill and would end in a Holocaust more dangerous and devastating for the continuity of European life than the First World War had been. Thus, the decade of the 1930s was a period full of anxiety and insecurity. From this time until January 30th, 1933, when their leader Adolf Hitler became chancellor, German politics was dominated by one issue: whether or not the Nazis would come to power. To deal with the immediate threat of rising German militarism, Einstein focused his efforts on convincing the world that they had the power to prevent the next war, arguing that if only 2% of those assigned to perform military service should announce their refusal to fight, governments would be powerless. They would not dare send such a large number of people to jail. He next urged the factory workers that built the munitions to step down from their jobs, denying their governments the ability to wage a wide-scale conflict. He used his immense celebrity platform to protest the League of Nations Disarmament Conference in 1932. Although he had initially supported the coming together of the world's would-be adversaries, he quickly came to realize that it was an exercise in futility, telling the world's press that he had walked out of the conference because one does not make wars less likely to occur by formulating rules of warfare. War cannot be humanized, he continued. It can only be abolished. People must be persuaded to refuse all military service. The conviction with which he pushed his ideas led many to believe that he had secretly converted to the political philosophy of communism. In a letter published within the text Einstein on Peace, he claimed that the conference was not a comedy, it is a tragedy, the greatest tragedy of modern times, despite the cap and bells and buffoonery. No one has any right to treat this tragedy lightly or to laugh when one should cry. We should be standing on rooftops, all of us, and denouncing this conference as a travesty. If the workers of this world, men and women, decide not to manufacture and transport ammunition, it would end war for all time. We must do that, dedicate our lives to drying up the source of war, ammunition factories. The trouble with most of these delegates is that they are unintelligent and insincere, and are but puppets moved by strings in the hands of politicians at home, politicians and ammunition manufacturers. Any declaration of war would be followed by worldwide revolutions. We must prevent that. Prevent the destruction of Western civilization by the uncivilized governments of the world. Words such as these would be directly used against him when he was later denounced as a communist spy during the McCarthy era of the Cold War. He continued to increase his profile within the increasingly anti-Semitic streets of Berlin when he donned a black skull cap and played his violin in front of Berlin Synagogue in order to raise funds for a local Jewish community welfare center. Clark reveals that he had once looked on assimilation as a mistake. Now he began to think of it as an impossibility. Incredibly, that particular synagogue was spared during the events of Kristallnacht, only to be destroyed by Allied bombing in 1943. Despite all of the threats to his life, the interminable march towards war, and subsequent interruptions to his work, Einstein remained in Berlin working on his unified field theory regarding electromagnetism. It was a bold move for a man who at the age of 50 was well past his intellectual prime. Scientific breakthroughs are typically reserved for men and women in their late 20s. Clark explains that in some ways he was embarking on a search for the physicist Hesperides, a scientific suicide mission on which even a man as capable as Einstein might fail. This is perhaps more certainly the view today, when it is generally felt that the structure of the universe cannot be described by using a single set of equations. He even agreed that the chance of success was very small, but that attempt must be made, and due to his previous breakthroughs, he could afford to take the risk of failure. He explained what he was attempting to do using plain language to the Daily Chronicle, articulating that, "For years it has been my greatest ambition to resolve the duality of natural laws into unity. This duality lies in the fact that physicists have hitherto been compelled to postulate two sets of laws, those which control gravitation and those which control the phenomenon of electricity and of magnetism. Many physicists have suspected that two sets of laws must be based upon one general law, but neither experiment nor theory has until now succeeded in formulating this law. I believe now that I have found a proper form. I have thought out a special construction, which is differentiated from that of my relativity theory, and from other theories of four-dimensional space through certain conditions. These conditions being under the same mathematical equations the laws which govern the electromagnetic field and those which govern the field of gravitation. The relativity theory reduced to one formula all laws which govern space-time and gravitation, and thus it corresponded to the demand for simplification of our physical concepts. The purpose of my work is to further the simplification, and particularly to reduce to one formula the explanation of the field of gravity and of the field of electromagnetism. For this reason, I call it a contribution to a unified field theory. Now, but only now, we know that the force which moves electrons in their ellipses about the nuclei of atoms is the same force which moves our Earth in its annual course about the Sun, and is the same force which brings to us the rays of light and heat which makes life possible on this planet. He published his findings, but a year later was back to revising them, unsatisfied with his own theoretical conclusions. He would chase the equations necessary for his theory for the rest of his life, making the unified field theory his own white whale, a chase from which he was unable to escape. Although threats continued to be made to his life, Albert eventually grew used to his new normal in Berlin. A relatively humorous incident in 1929 showed the annoyances that he had to deal with on a regular basis. The The city council was persuaded on his 50th birthday by one of Einstein's colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Society to gift their most famous resident a house befitting his accomplishments. I'll draw heavily from Clark for the bureaucratic hijinks that ensued. Einstein was presented with a new home and garden upon one of his favorite lakes. Tipped off beforehand, Berlin magazines even printed pictures of the property labeled the Einstein House. But when Elsa arrived at their new home, she discovered that someone was already living within it, and that they had no intention of evacuating the property. The council apologized for the mistake and attempted to placate the physicist by giving him a parcel of land from which he could build a house of his own design. Only upon hiring an architect, however, did they become aware of a city ordinance which prevented anyone from building anything upon the property which could obstruct the view of the neighbors. The third time wasn't the charm, as the city council gave him a new piece of property which turned out to not be theirs to give. Throwing up their hands, the council annoyingly told Einstein to pick out some land and that they would pay for it. The Einsteins settled on a remote one-street village outside of Berlin, solving the problem of the gift once and for all. At least that's what they had thought. By now, the comical attempts at resettling the famous family had received loads of publicity, and the Nazi government began to openly wonder why, in the midst of an economic recession, the city was spending money on one of its leading citizens. Wanting to be done with it, Albert graciously told the council that while he appreciated the gesture, his birthday had long since passed and that he would purchase the land without any government assistance. Doing so ate up their entire savings. But the peace of the rural countryside and the sense of security which it gave them was worth it. But why was the receiving of a gift so difficult for a man who had brought untold amounts of prestige to the nation of Germany? The American Psychological Association points out that one of the most common outlets for racism comes in the form of microaggressions. The organization points out that this form of racism is so subtle that neither victim nor perpetrator may entirely understand what is going on, which may be especially toxic for people of color, or in Einstein's instance, ethnicity. The council likely meant well, haphazardly approving the gifting of land which had been selected by their bureaucratic underlings. Clark explains that the issue lay in the hands of persons who sabotaged the work of those serving on the council. The officials of the city of Berlin carried out the orders of the municipal council in such a way as to result in failure, and to make the Republican administration look ridiculous. By this point in time, the Nazi Party and its associates had already begun to infiltrate the bureaucratic apparatus of the dying Weimar state, a fact that was unrealized by those who were supposedly in charge. The pushback continued in 1931 with the publication of the book 100 Authors Against Einstein, which utilized pseudoscience and the very bottom of the scientific barrel to throw cold water on the theory of relativity. The work is such a piece of junk which doesn't even live up to its title, as only 28 authors contributed essays for the work. Einstein cleverly responded to the book's publication, stating that, if he were wrong, they would only need one author to prove it. He again considered fleeing Berlin permanently, but was once again talked out of it by his co-workers. Still, he arranged his travels so that he would spend 1/3 of the year at Berkeley in California and another third of it in Oxford, England. Albert and his wife had a better time in America than during their previous experience in 1921, when he had been shuttled across the Atlantic in order to raise funds for the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. During that visit, he had managed to shake loose the hefty amount of $250,000 from American pockets. But Einstein soured on the nation after an off-the-record interview with a German publication was reprinted in the New York Times. The American paper ran only the most salacious bits, including comments that women dominate the entire life in America while men take an interest in absolutely nothing at all, serving as the, quote, toy dogs of the women who spend the money in a most unmeasurable, illimitable way. He also claimed that there was little to do in America except to watch the impoverished wretches that were supposedly on every corner. He even took a shot at the nation's scientific community, proclaiming that it was nonsense to compare the general scientific life in America to Europe. Now, 10 years later, the Einsteins were headed by ship to California to check out Dr. Hubble and the world's most impressive telescope. He attempted to smooth things over with the Times by agreeing to write an editorial for them regarding his views on religion, which were pretty secular in nature. That, however, alienated the Catholic Church, which retained significant power on the East Coast. Attempting to make amends, the Einsteins reversed their earlier decision to avoid stepping off the boat upon reaching New York. The decision was because they likely knew the truth of the New York Times statement that he cannot hope to keep his features out of the New York press unless he locks himself in the purser's safe. And even then, there will be pictures taken of the safe. Immediately after stepping one foot on the dock, he had the recorders of reporters shoved in his face, asking him to explain the fourth dimension in one word, to describe relativity in one sentence, and provide social commentary on American political events such as prohibition. Most interestingly for our study, however, is his answer to the question, "What do you think of Hitler?" Albert responded to that one with wishful thinking, stating that, "I do not enjoy Mr. Hitler's acquaintance. Hitler is living on the empty stomach of Germany. As soon as economic conditions in Germany improve, he will cease to be important." After the quick stop in New York, their ship passed through the Panama Canal before landing in Pasadena. There were sightseeing moments, such as sitting down for dinner with Charlie Chaplin, but as was typically the case, Einstein was dead set on getting as much work done as possible. Hubble's discoveries had placed Albert's theoretical estimation of space in question, as what they had recently discovered, despite their limited technological advancements, was already butting up against his largest estimate. Clark writes that Einstein officially announced that he had abandoned the idea of a closed spherical universe, agreeing that his initial idea had to be given up, and it is typical that he did so only after he had personally met Hubble and peered with him through the magnifiers at the revealing pictures of galaxies from what was then the largest telescope in the world. Rather than being frustrated, he counted himself blessed for having been wrong about the size of the universe, stating that, "I am thinking that, after all, our sun is a very small star. All the universe's eggs were not in this basket that was now infested by the Nazis." And this thought is convincingly consoling. After his Berkeley residency was up, he and Elsa traveled by train, first to Chicago and then back to New York Harbor. The speeches that he gave largely fell beneath the umbrella of pacifism. He next headed to England for a 4-week stay with the newly formed Rhodes Society. Clark notes that in Oxford he saw an England very different from the formality of his previous host, Lord Haldane's London residence, an England where his Jewishness, his German ancestry, and his stature as a scientist all tended to be taken for granted and then passed over so that he could be weighed and considered as a human being. He liked the experience. He enjoyed his host's friends. He soaked up the atmosphere of an Oxford that has largely disappeared in the last 50 years. Reality, however, smacked him in the face upon his return to Berlin, writing that the situation here is horrible. All money values have disappeared, and the people are disturbed and embittered against the government. The future that lies ahead is threatening and dark. He soon made the decision to return temporarily to America for Caltech. The newly formed Institute for Advanced Study reached out to him, hoping to convince the world's most elite scientists of their aim to provide him a comparable option to what he enjoyed at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. He arrived home just in time for the 1932 elections, which positively saw Hindenburg soundly defeat Adolf Hitler. Still, the Nazis took their seats as the leading minority party and watched as Hindenburg's newly formed government floundered beneath Chancellor Franz von Papen. 1 month after the results were announced, a leading Nazi congressman went on record that when we clean house, the exodus of the children of Israel will be a child's game in comparison. Faced with such dark prospects upon the horizon, Albert Einstein accepted the offer from the American-based Institute for Advanced Study, despite the fact that the compensation was half of what he had believed and that the newly formed organization would reside in Princeton, New Jersey, rather than sunny California. Despite all of this, he still wasn't willing to quit the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, only taking the American job for 5 months of each of the next 5 years. He proclaimed to the papers that I am not abandoning Germany. My permanent home will still be in Berlin. At the moment of his announcement, it must have seemed as though he had escaped the frying pan into the fire, for American anti-Semitic groups immediately attacked the proclamation. Obviously, American anti-Semitism paled in comparison to the Nazis, but that doesn't mean that it was some joke. The National Patriotic Council and the American Women's League alleged that he was a German Bolshevik who was only coming over to spy for the communists. Hate groups oftentimes disguise their true intentions by hiding beneath a patriotic-sounding name. The ABC affiliate in Indianapolis once unmasked the newly formed patriotic-sounding American Guard as the rebranded Sons of Odin, a collection, in the station's words, of open white supremacists, as well as other right-wing extremists. Carla Hill of the Anti-Defamation League writes that what we're seeing is part of a conscious effort of white supremacists to tone down their rhetoric to edge closer to the alt-right. They're trying to tone down their rhetoric to normalize hatred, bigotry, and violence. In 1932, that meant that the American Women's League were choosing to use their opposition to Einstein in order to normalize the fear of all foreigners, or perhaps just Jews. Einstein, as was his way, had some fun with their plan to boycott anything produced by him, stating that, "Never before have I experienced from the fair sex such energetic rejection of all advances, or if I have, never from so many at once." He couldn't resist an ad hominem attack, however, cloaking it within an intelligent statement that he likely imagined would go right over the heads of his deranged opponents, telling all that, "But are they not quite right, these watchful women? Why should one open one's door to a person who devours hard-boiled capitalists with as much appreciation and gusto as the Cretan Minotaur in his days gone by devoured luscious Greek maidens, and on top of that is low down enough to reject every sort of war except the unavoidable war with one's own wife? Therefore, give heed to your clever and patriotic womenfolk, and remember that the capital of mighty Rome was once saved by the cackling of its faithful geese." This time, when the happy couple left their vacation home on the outskirts of Berlin, he told Elsa to take a good look, for it was unlikely that they would ever see it again. For his third visit within 3 years to America, Albert Einstein was slightly muzzled by the terms of the institute, which was funding his entire salary via a grant that sought to bridge the gulf between American and German scientists. Thus, we lack the usual anti-Hitler, pro-pacifism commentary that came along with his other treks across the Atlantic. It was during this time that Adolf Hitler was appointed as Chancellor. The decision to promote the Nazi leader was one which backfired massively in the German president's face. Hindenburg believed that he could control Hitler by limiting the number of Nazis within the cabinet. The prior 3 chancellors had failed spectacularly, and if the same happened to Hitler, the Nazis would be unable to continue rising via their strategy of attacking the government while falsely claiming to remain political outsiders. Actions speak louder than words. Rather than offer commentary on the political appointment, Albert Einstein immediately canceled all scheduled lectures in and around Germany, telling his friends that he dare not enter Germany because of Hitler. Within a month, the Reichstag was ablaze, and the Nazis shrewdly maneuvered their way into power after arresting the members of the Communist Party who were supposedly in conjunction with the overt act of arson. Pre-planned emergency decrees were hastily pushed through, establishing a legal dictatorship with Hitler at its head. A PR war was launched alongside the political coup, which included an article in a leading publication for right-wing extremists which singled out Albert Einstein for the crimes of cultural internationalism, international treason, and pacifist excesses. 40 days after Hitler's appointment, Einstein sat for an interview with the New York World Telegram, proclaiming that, as long as I have any choice in the matter, I shall live only in a country where civil liberty, tolerance, and equality of all citizens before the law prevail. Civil liberty implies freedom to express one's political convictions, in speech and in writing. Tolerance implies respect for the convictions of others, whatever they may be. These conditions do not exist in Germany at the present time. Clark informs us that as he left the room, Los Angeles, 100 miles away, was shaken by the worst earthquake in its history. Symbolically, the reporter was able to note that as he left for the seminar, walking across the campus, Dr. Einstein felt the ground shaking under his feet. In a clear sign that our genius didn't fully comprehend the change that had occurred within Germany, he continued to communicate with his colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, expecting to be able to keep up on his work with them remotely. He was still mistakenly under the impression when he stopped by New York for the launch of his publication of The Fight Against War, a hastily produced book which consisted of his annotated works regarding pacifism. Clark teaches us that, so far, he had given the world no other reaction of the world's most famous Jew to the rise of the world's most famous Jew baiter. That was the way he wanted it. Now at the Waldorf Astoria, he stepped into the ring, attacking the German Academy of Arts, pointing out that in Germany pacifists were considered enemies of the state, and saying that the world should be made more aware of the dangers of Hitlerism. All this made it easier for the German authorities to attack him. But his honesty in speaking out, without reservation, and while on a mission of molding public opinion to better German-American relations, made their task that much simpler. The New York German consular warned him that if the physicist returned to Germany, that they would drag him through the streets by his hair. Despite everything, he sailed back to Europe, destined for Belgium. While traversing the Atlantic, Albert received word of the dismissal of more than 1,600 Jewish lecturers and professors from their jobs, armed raids upon his Berlin residences, and the freezing of his bank accounts. His first order of business upon reaching European shores was to again renounce his German citizenship and resign from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. He watched in horror as the Nazi regime remade Germany into the vile creature which Albert had abhorred as a child, one which had turned schools at every level into factories producing the next generation of soldiers. Now the education system had been turned against his fellow Jews, with across-the-board curriculum that was specifically designed to prove the unworthiness of men and women that were descended from a race of people who had settled in Germany as early as the year 321. One German professor announced that nowadays the task of the universities is not to cultivate objective science, but soldier-like militant science, and their foremost task is to form the will and character of their students. Clark explains that 4 months into Hitler's reign, and years before what most individuals would say is the official beginning of the Holocaust, there arrived a special album published in Germany containing photographs of leading opponents of the Nazi government. On the first page was a portrait of Einstein. Underneath it were the words, "Discovered a much contested theory of relativity, was greatly honored by the Jewish press and the unsuspecting German people, showed his gratitude by plying atrocity propaganda against Adolf Hitler abroad." And then, in parentheses, there were the words, "Not yet hanged." Although he had plenty of options to replenish his bank accounts, Einstein chose Oxford, England. The letter he sent requesting refuge lacks any arrogance for the professor who now lacked a home, stating that a small room would be enough for him if they could spare it. Now a refugee will continue to explore his evolution from pacifist to the ultimate bomb maker in our next episode. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contacting EmpiresPod on Bluesky. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.